So welcome to the first director's lecture in my tenure as the Roman family director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. And today, the Neubauer Collegium entered a new phase as we officially moved into our new building just a few hours ago. And as you know, the Neubauer Collegium supports creative, collaborative research throughout the humanities and the social sciences. And I can think of no one who better embodies our emerging ideals than Quentin Skinner. Since 2008, Professor Skinner has been the Barber Beaumont Professor of the Humanities at Queen Mary, University of London, which is now a world center of research in political thought. But I would like to focus for a moment on a half century before he arrived there. It was that long ago that Quentin came up to Cambridge to read history as he received his BA in 1962. Now, I mentioned that year because in the very same year, Quentin was elected a Fellow of Christ's College. The Fellows of Christ wanted him in their intellectual company immediately, and by my reckoning, he was 21 years old at the time. The Fellows did not want to wait for him to get an MA, and as far as I can tell, Quentin never did get around to obtaining a PhD, though over the years, he has received 10 honorary doctorates from great universities around the world. And I'm pleased to be able to tell you that his first honorary doctorate came from the University of Chicago. And it's only years later that Oxford, Harvard, the University of Copenhagen, the University of Oslo, the University of Helsinki, the University of London, the University of Athens, the University of Aberdeen, the University of St. Andrews followed suit. Now, Skinner served 46 years as a Fellow of Christ's College, eventually becoming the Regius Professor of History of Cambridge. He's still an honorary fellow and a life fellow there. Well, during this period, there grew up what came to be known as the Cambridge School of Intellectual and Political History. And Skinner was at the center of this group, which included other historians such as J.G.A. Pocock, Peter Laslett, John Donne, Richard Tuck, and David Runciman. And in terms of the humanities and social sciences, this is one of the great intellectual collaborations of the past century. The Cambridge School, of course, has its critics, and some of them are vehement, but it is not an exaggeration to say that Skinner's work changed the way intellectual history and the history of political thought are done. Agree or disagree, one can no longer be in the field without coming to grips with his thought. Now, his first book, which is a 2-volume Foundations of Modern Political Thought, was instantly recognized as a classic, and that judgment has stood the test of time. And I think it's worth our noting that this first book of his came out in 1978, which is 16 years after his initial academic appointment at Cambridge began. And it took that kind of time to produce a work of this magnitude, and the institution gave him the nurturance that he needed. The Foundations of Modern Political Thought is a magisterial study of the development of our conceptions of sovereignty, liberty, and republic in the Renaissance and Reformation. And it's integral to Skinner's thought that in order to understand the central political ideas with which we now live, we have to understand how we came to inherit them. And to understand that, we need to recover the broad historical contexts in which those ideas were earlier deployed, as well as the myriad contingencies by which thought moved one way rather than another. And only then, Skinner argues, can we understand what thinkers meant by what they said, as well as what they were trying to do in the political realm. Now, these thoughts have been worked out in subsequent remarkable studies of Machiavelli and Hobbes, on conceptions of liberty before our age of liberalism, in a series of dazzling and passionate essays on methodology, and just published in Forensic Shakespeare, which is a tour de force in which Skinner shows us the depth of Shakespeare's reliance on ancient and Renaissance forms of judicial persuasion in the writing of his plays. Now, today, Professor Skinner will speak on how we should think about freedom. I'm going to leave it to him to speak about freedom, but I would like to make a brief remark about the first 4 words of his title. How should we think? Not what should we think. The division between the humanities and social sciences is, I think, less a matter of subject matter or areas of inquiry, and more a matter of how we think, of different manners of mind. And it's not an accident that history departments are sometimes located within the social sciences, as here at the University of Chicago, but at other universities they are in humanities faculties, because both manners of mind are regularly deployed, and we can see them both exemplified in Skinner's work. On the one hand, there's the research which keeps the inquiring subject at a rigorous distance from the objective data that he or she is uncovering. And on the other hand, Skinner is trying to recover an ancient and largely lost conception of freedom. And to the extent that he succeeds, it's not merely that we learn more about freedom, our freedom is thereby enhanced. For freedom is, in part, created by our self-conscious understanding of what freedom is. And the very activity of thinking new possibilities for freedom is the activity of developing those possibilities. Thinking more freely about freedom helps us to be free. How should we think? Not how do we think or how will we think. Skinner believes that proper historical study will not simply increase our knowledge of the past, it will guide us toward our future. And precisely because Skinner has been so concerned with recovering the complexities of historical context, he's been accused by some of his critics of antiquarianism. And this is a charge that Skinner writes, and I'm quoting from Quentin Skinner now, quote, "That charge troubles me deeply, and it is one that all professional historians ought to stand ready to answer, at least to the satisfaction of their own consciences. We must expect to be asked, and we must not fail to ask ourselves, what is supposed to be the point of it all," unquote. And he also says, quote, "We ought to be prepared to ask ourselves quite aggressively what is supposed to be the practical use here and now of our historical studies," unquote. Skinner's work is a model of how we might derive value from facts, namely the value of living forward with a more animated and informed sense of what is possible for us. And finally, how should we think? This is the essence of intellectual collaboration. The we here is not a collection of individuals, each of us thinking on his or her own. This is the we of all of us who care about freedom of the human spirit, thinking together about what our freedom might consist in. Now, I don't want to enumerate Quentin Skinner's prodigious lists of honors. It would embarrass him, and anyway, enough is enough. But I do want to mention one last honor that delights me. At the end of a half-century of active participation in the life of Christ's College, the Master and Fellows commissioned this portrait of Quentin Skinner that now hangs in the Fellows' parlor of the college. Other portraits you can see as you walk through the college include John Milton and Charles Darwin, and I think this portrait captures the joyful inquisitiveness that characterizes Quentin Skinner, the man. And it is a wonderful way of the college honoring a lifetime of intellectual collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Quentin Skinner.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for these extremely kind and very welcoming words. It's a joy to be back in Chicago. The Neubauer Collegium is an extraordinarily generous and imaginative addition to this very great university. And I feel deeply honored to be invited to talk here, especially at this time of the inauguration of the Collegium's new home. As you see, my theme this afternoon is freedom, although Jonathan has just stolen all my best lines, but I will struggle on. And as freedom is unquestionably one of our core moral as well as political values, it would be good if I could manage to work towards an account of it on which we might, at least in principle, be able to agree. But here I tend to agree with what Nietzsche says about such projects of analysis in the great text, The Genealogy of Morality. Concepts that have histories, he suggests, just cannot have such definitions. And freedom or liberty, I shall use them interchangeably, is undoubtedly one such concept, because its meaning and application have been debated throughout the history of the modern world. So how should we proceed? The only way, it seems to me, is historically. Trying to see how the concept has evolved in our culture, but also how it has been contested, how rival understandings have emerged and done battle over time. The key notion in this kind of intellectual history, it seems to me, is dialogue. So it's this kind of a genealogy that I shall attempt. But obviously this is a vast, indeed unwieldy enterprise, and I need to do something to bring my materials under some kind of control. So what I've decided to do is to concentrate on how the concept has been discussed and contested in Anglophone moral and political thought. This is not because I necessarily believe that the Anglophone case is the most interesting one, but it is what I know about. And I've come to see, after many years of giving lectures, that it's best to limit yourself to what you know about. But if that suddenly looks parochial, I should add that, as it happens, the Anglophone tradition of thinking about this particular concept has been of extraordinary importance in the modern world, partly, of course, because of the special importance of this country in the modern world. Now, within the Anglophone tradition, the earliest treatise in which the concepts of civil and political liberty are systematically analysed is also, as it happens, well, I don't think as it happens, this will be bound to be so. There's an incandescent work in which the whole thing is clarified. And in the Anglophone tradition, that work is Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, originally published in 1651. Chapter 21 of Leviathan, which is entitled Of the Liberty of Subjects, really inaugurates the modern debate. And so I'll start with it. And a further merit of starting with Hobbes is that his understanding of liberty has turned out to be extraordinarily influential, so that his analysis is also a very familiar one, as you will see. I've called it the liberal concept of individual freedom, and as you'll see, it's a simple concept. It has just two components. It's proposed that for an individual to enjoy freedom as a citizen of a state, there must be power on the part of the individual to act in pursuit of a given option or alternative, and there must be no interference with the exercise of that power by any external agencies. Let me just take those two ideas into... I'm told I'm not allowed to... I like to roam around, but I'm not allowed to, am I? No. I'm being filmed. First, all right, power, I'll point. Hobbes insists, this is valuable, I think, that it makes no sense to talk about freedom of action except in relation to your having a power to act. There's a strong tendency in contemporary analytical political theory to suppose that, I quote Jerry Cohen in his essay Freedom and Money, 2008, inability is a sufficient condition of unfreedom. If you're unable, you're unfree. Hobbes suggests, usefully I think, that that is not the best way to set about thinking about the relationship. He wants to suggest that if you lack the ability to act in a certain way, then you are neither free to perform that action, nor are you unfree to perform your action, because you simply lack the power. So the question of freedom does not arise. It arises later, rather Foucauldian thought. To put the same point the other way round, and thereby bring out its importance, if you are unfree to act in some particular way, this must be because some agency has disempowered you. So I turn secondly to the idea of interference. And Hobbes's claim here is, in effect, about how you need to understand this core idea of being disempowered. You are said to be disempowered and hence unfree if and only if some other agent has interfered with you in the exercise of a power. So on this analysis, freedom simply consists in absence of interference by external agencies. I'm very aware that it's quite a test on the eyesight if you're at the back, but can you see it all right? Yeah, very good, thank you. Now, of course, that also explains something which is absolutely central to current parlance about freedom, the idea that it might be what's called a negative concept, by which I simply understand that the claim is that the presence of freedom is always marked by some kind of an absence. And if you ask, well, what is the absence that marks the presence of freedom? There it is, absence of interference. But obviously that does not get us very far, because if freedom is an empty notion, and the positive idea is interference, then of course what you need an account of is, well, what is to count as interference? Now, again, Hobbes here offers you a rather self-consciously straightforward analysis, which I've laid out here. External agencies are said to interfere when they act upon the body of an individual in such a way that an action within the powers of that individual is either prevented or compelled due to the application of physical force by the external agency in such a way as to render the pursuit of an alternative by the individual impossible. Now, that's a mouthful, but you can summarize it, as Hobbes does in chapter 21, by saying, I quote him, liberty is simply absence of external impediments of motion. So there's the Hobbesian analysis. And I'd just like to pause and contemplate it for a moment. And as we do contemplate it, I want to try to make 3 points. The first, at the top of the slide, is that I've spoken of agencies, not just agents. I want to keep the predication wide, as does Hobbes, because on his account, the external force that takes away your freedom of action could be a purely natural force. Secondly, notice, if I may, at the middle of the slide, that you can always, and this is obvious, but you can always be disempowered for pursuing an alternative in one of 2 ways. Someone can either act upon you in such a way as to stop you from acting in a certain way, or else compel you to act in a certain way. 2 modalities of the loss of liberty. And thirdly, you'll notice also at the middle of the slide an important implication of Hobbes's account. It is said to be only bodily interference that takes away freedom of action. Now, that's a massively important implication, because the implicit claim is that if it's only your will that is coerced, as for example, if you obey the law simply out of fear of the consequences of disobeying, which I suppose is a standard reason for obeying the law, but Hobbes wants to say that in those circumstances you obey entirely freely, and you're always entirely free to disobey. And as he puts it, again, a more elegant summary than I can offer, chapter 21 again, fear and liberty are consistent. Now, that's very important to him, and he really means it. It goes for the clear-edged analysis of freedom that he's trying to offer us. And he illustrates it with an example which is actually rather common in early modern philosophy. John Locke uses it more than once, the figure of the highwayman. The highwayman stops your coach and points a pistol and says, your money or your life. I mean, we have a modern version of it, but that's the idea. Now, Hobbes says, when you decide to hand over your money, don't forget you were offered a choice. You could have handed over your life, so don't say you didn't act willingly, and on Hobbes's account, freely. And as he puts it in what strikes me as a nasty joke, you will find, when you act in this type of case, that you not only do so willingly, but very willingly. So there's the Hobbesian version of what I'm calling the liberal analysis of liberty. Now, that way of thinking that you're looking at has had an extraordinary influence on modern political philosophy. And indeed, if you look at 2 of the most ambitious recent treatises on the theory of political freedom, I'm thinking here of Ian Carter's book, The Measure of Freedom, published by Oxford in 1999, or Matthew Kramer's book, The Quality of Freedom, a major treatise of 2003. I mean, Matthew's book is an enormous book, but fortunately, everything that it says is like that. I mean, that's what he says. So that genealogical line comes right down to our age. But you might think that it shouldn't. You might think there's something obviously amiss with this view about the compatibility of free action with coercion of the will. And the view that there is something which has gone wrong in this point of the analysis was immediately taken up in the generation after Hobbes. In fact, people were horrified by it. And I now want to turn to that generation in my genealogy, and in particular to note the criticism to be found in the most celebrated work of political philosophy of that generation, very influential, of course, in 18th century America, John Locke's two treatises of government, originally published in 1690. And I now want to say a word about Locke's handling of this issue in that text. Now, Locke, of course, agrees that you're unfree to act if you're bodily prevented from exercising the power. I mean, very few people would disagree with that. I mean, Boethius would, but he's talking about freedom of thought. But what Locke wants to say is, of course, you have also been rendered unfree if your will has been coerced. And I quote the second treatise, this is paragraph 176. Should a robber break into my house and with a dagger at my throat make me seal documents to convey my estate to him, would that give him title? Notice it's a purely rhetorical question. What Locke wants you to agree with straight off is that in such a predicament, it's just obvious that you have no alternative. You are therefore not fully free to act otherwise, and hence cannot be said to have acted freely at all. It's true, of course, that coercion of the will does not render actions impossible to perform, but that's the mistake. If, as Jeremy Bentham was later to put it, the action is rendered sufficiently ineligible, that's to say you would never freely choose it, then if you perform it, it cannot be that it is a free action. So we now want to add those thoughts to our genealogy. And it begins to look genealogical. I now have Hobbes on the extreme left wing, but that's just because I'm irritated with him. He doesn't want to be there. There he is, going down on the left. But now we have Locke's proposed edition on the right. So Locke's complete claim, to summarize, is that unfreedom arises when there's either interference by external agents of a bodily kind to render action impossible, or else by action upon your will. Locke's phrase is, by a bending of your will to their designs, you are rendered unfree. But notice, this was Hobbes's cunning, we're now confronted with a concept which makes no appearance in Hobbes's political philosophy, and which is a very tricky concept to think about, namely coercion. And indeed, look at the way in which it's now being made to bear practically all of the weight of the analysis of what political freedom consists in. So that being so, I find it remarkable that John Locke never offers us an account of what he means by coercion. He just offers us some examples. And he lists them in paragraph 222 of the second treatise. Threats, promises, offers, bribes. But if you think about that list just for a moment, it shows that there's a sore need for analysis here, because surely it cannot be the case that any instance of my bending your will to my designs can count as a case of coercion. I mean, for example, Locke on the list I've just given you there includes bribes. But is it really true that if I offer you a bribe, I thereby coerce you into acting in a certain way? I mean, suppose a politician accused of accepting a bribe assures the judge in court that he should not be held responsible because the bribe was so enormous that he just had no alternative but to accept it. That's not going to be an acceptable plea. And points, obviously, to the fact that we need something that Hobbes doesn't need and Locke doesn't supply, which is what is the sort and what is the extent of the bending of the will that is coercion? Well, as far as I can see, the first Anglophone legal or political philosopher who addresses that question square on is Jeremy Bentham. So the genealogy moves down a century. Bentham, in his remarkable treatise on the limits of the penal branch of legislation, which he wrote in the early 1780s. Bentham's proposal is that here's the key distinction that you need to seize. What do you think of this? There are two different ways, essentially, of bending someone's will. One is to promise them that you will reward them for compliance with your will, so that if they resist, they're no better off. They're no worse off. If they accept, they're better off. If they decline, they're no worse off. The contrast is to threaten someone that you will penalize them for non-compliance with your will, so that if they resist, they will be worse off. Now, Bentham's proposal is that we can properly speak of coercion only in the second case. That's to say, where I am threatened for penalties, with penalties for non-compliance, because the alternative there is the same or worse off, whereas in the other case, it's the same or better off. So he thinks of the latter as a choice and the former as a coerced choice. Indeed, that is what he takes coercion to be a paradigm case of. Provided, he adds, that there are certain conditions attached to the threat itself. And these are very sensible conditions he attaches. It must be credible, it must be serious, and it must be immediate. Okay, those are intuitive, but I think that's a very good analysis. And there's his account. Now, some contemporary philosophers, there's classic work by Robert Nozick on this, have pointed out this doesn't quite work because someone could propose a reward for you which is nevertheless coercive. But Bentham may, I think, be said to have isolated the basic case of coercion, that of being threatened with consequences so unpleasant for failing to comply that you do comply. And I think that analysis has been quite generally agreed. So let us add it to our story. Coercion by the rendering of an action ineligible by means of threats which have that quality attached to them. Now, is that perhaps the analysis of freedom that you want? If so, this is a very short lecture. That might be quite a relief. Here's the interesting point. Within Anglophone liberal tradition, it was not only agreed for a long time that that's it, that's how to think about the concept, but that view also came down the genealogy, not merely to our own times, but if you were to ask, within the last generation, which has been the most cited discussion of the concept of political liberty in the Anglophone tradition, there's no contest. It's Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. You're looking at it. That's his preferred concept. However, within the liberal tradition, there arose a further complicating moment when John Stuart Mill publishes his classic essay, the most famous single piece of writing on our topic, I suppose, in the English language, on liberty, published in 1859. One of the moves that Mill makes in this text is to point out that the liberal tradition, as thus far, endorses one principle that Mill thinks is questionable. And there it is, at the top of what you're looking at. That freedom consists in the absence of interference with the exercise of your powers by external agencies. By another person, another group, a natural force, the state, and so forth. And this agency either threatens you or leaves you powerless, and that is unfreedom. But what Mill asks in chapter 3 of his essay is it true that freedom is always, or is it true that freedom is necessarily an interpersonal idea in this way? Or could it be that the agent who takes away your freedom could somehow be yourself? Now, as soon as you entertain that thought, the chart of the liberal tradition, the genealogy of the tradition, begins to look more complicated. And this complication is what emerges in an extraordinary period of social and political philosophy of the latter part of the 19th, the early part of the 20th century, when successive attempts are made to try to make sense of this radical extension of the notion of interference. So we now need the genealogy with this added. External agencies or the self preventing or compelling its own actions due to the operation of, well, what? Well, here the writers I'm discussing really begin to wade into deep philosophical waters. But there are several answers that they attempt to defend, and I now want to turn to explore them. And here is the first. Here the suggestion is about the geography of the soul. The will can act, can so to speak, ally itself with either reason or with some passion. Just a list of the passions, which is also, of course, conveniently a list of the deadly sins: rage, envy, hatred, and so forth. So where the resulting action is motivated by reason, it is free. But where it is driven by passion, the resulting action is not free, since it is an instance, and here I introduce a distinction that was of great importance in early modern philosophy. We still use it colloquially, but for them it was a real matter of conceptual life and death. That is not a free action, because that is not freedom, that is license. Liberty and license are opposed to each other in a very deep way. Now, I have to admit that this distinction, that's to say the distinction between liberty and license, which of course is certainly implicit in Mill, does have deeper roots than the 19th century formulations. Mill, of course, connects, as you know, free action with what he calls the permanent interests, that's to say, as opposed to the transient desires, of man as a progressive being. But as I say, there are deeper roots than the late 19th century developments of this theme than that, because after all, this picture of the geography of the soul was known to Plato in the Timaeus, was presented in the Timaeus, and that became an Anglophone text because Erasmus translated it in 1536. And although, of course, it's one of Hobbes's avowed aims in his philosophy to abolish any distinction between liberty and license, he never thinks there is such a distinction. And that's, of course, on the grounds that all action is caused by passion. The view which philosophers usually call Humean, that's just because they don't know enough about the 17th century. But it is indeed Hume's view, but the reason it's Hume's view is he copied it out of Hobbes. He copied a lot out of Hobbes. So reason cannot motivate, and there's the Hobbesian view. But Locke, of course, wants to reinstate for you, both in the essay concerning human understanding and in the True Teachings of Government, this fundamental distinction between liberty and license. And you find that in the second treatise. That ill deserves the name of confinement that saves us but from bogs and precipices. That's to say, if you operate reason, the action is free. If you act licentiously, you are, as they like to say, a slave to passion. However, John Stuart Mill is much more interested in what he takes to be a second internal source of constraint upon our own social freedom, and here it is. No, it isn't. I was rather pleased with the way I was bringing them up, but they don't always come, do they? Now, Mill introduces this suggestion with the claim that, as he says at the beginning of the essay on liberty, I quote, "In our time, mid-19th century England, the yoke of law has become lighter, but the yoke of opinion heavier." And it's certainly true that in Europe generally, as in this country in the 18th century, so in the 17th century, pleas for freedom are generally pleas against some particular state. But Mill, here very like Tocqueville, is much more impressed by the power of society, of civil society, not the state, to limit our freedom by demanding conformity to its conventions and norms. And Mill thinks that if this demand is very strong, as he thought it was in Victorian Britain, then the effect can be to make you inauthentically internalize these social norms until you follow them in preference to your authentic desires. I quote Liberty, chapter 3. "The people of England think themselves free, but they choose what is customary in preference to their inclination until it does not occur to them to have any inclination except for what is customary. And then the mind itself has become bound to the yoke. You are unfree because of your inauthenticity." So no one who has not reflected on their choices can be said to act as a fully free agent. Let me round off, if I may, this part of my discussion by adding a word about the third possibility raised in late 19th century social theory, although admittedly this will cause me for a moment to skid off my strictly Anglophone track. And here it is. This possibility speaks of the self undermining the conditions of its own freedom by acting with false consciousness and hence contrary to our real or human interests. The crucial suggestion here, which in English political theory was adopted by socialist writers of the late 19th and early 20th century, like G.D.H. Cole, R.H. Tawney, and others, comes, of course, from the social philosophy of Marx. And Marx, as you remember, had claimed at the beginning of Capital that social being determines consciousness, to which the additional thought was made that if your consciousness is determined, it's going to be determined, if it's determined by a society in which your freedom of action is conceived in bourgeois terms, and hence essentially in consumerist terms, then you are becoming the agent of your own servitude by endorsing a consumerist, and as these writers would want to say thereby, a false account of what is actually in your interest. That's to say, it may be in line with your phenomenal desires, but it is not in line with your real interests. Now, of the possibilities I've listed there, this is the one that has most of all come down the genealogy to our own time, because it not only animated the Frankfurt School, who eventually, of course, were writing from this country, but most of all, in our time, the early work of Jürgen Habermas on the need to reflect on our real interests as opposed to our phenomenal desires, if we want to form the basis for a free society. That's as much as I want to say under this heading, but this is the most important thing I want to say under this heading, which is that, I mean, there's no doubt no such thing on earth as an exhaustive typology. And I don't want you to suppose that anything I say this afternoon is meant to be an exhaustive typology. And I will punctuate the rest of this talk with some questions about it. I mean, one possibility that might immediately occur to you, and if I hadn't been introduced by Professor Jonathan Lear, I might have said a word about it, is Freud's theory is a theory of liberation. But I'm certainly not going to get into that. Well, now we have an array of different conceptions of freedom, and I think you'd have to concede it's a genealogy, it's not a linear narrative. But notice that all items in this genealogy have one basic theme in common. They all explicate freedom as absence of interference. It turns out to be an extraordinarily complex concept, interference. But notice it's done all the work. There it is at the top, and all the arrows follow from it. So freedom is fending off intruders of some kind. They may be internal intruders, but they will be intruders. But towards the end of the 19th century, which is where my genealogy has now reached, a number of Anglophone political philosophers began to argue that this vision is radically incomplete. In fact, it's wrong. This is not how to think about freedom at all. Drawing, they claimed, on the philosophy of Hegel, they began to argue that the idea of liberty as nothing more than an absence of interference is itself nothing more than the seizing of the negative moment in a dialectic of liberty. Freedom, that's to say, may require absence of impediment, but what we need to know is what we want not to be impeded from doing. We want some account of the content of freedom. Well, there's a very obvious retort which you're looking at, and it's one of the glories of the liberal tradition, which is it's already there. We want to be unimpeded from pursuing whatever options we may happen to entertain for ourselves. So you could say that there's always that element, that positive element in the idea of freedom. You can always ask what someone wants to be free from impediments in order to do, but the answer might just be to do whatever you want, within the limits, as Mill would want to add, of the harm principle. But at this stage, I'm wanting to note the arrival of a very different answer that rose to prominence, as I say, in Anglophone political philosophy at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. According to this view of things, we want to be free, not merely in order to be able to act at will, but rather in order to act in such a way as to realize the essence of our nature. A leading exponent of this view, T.H. Green, in his book on the principles of political obligation, puts it thus, I quote, "To be free is to have realized that which we have it in ourselves to become." So according to this view of freedom, we ought therefore to characterize as free only those persons who, as Green puts it, I quote again, have in fact acted in such a way as to realize the essence of their nature. Now, in the hands of Green, and later of such major philosophers as Bradley, and of course Bernard Bosanquet, this becomes for a time a powerful new strand in liberal thought. And its exponents place great emphasis on its novelty, that's to say, on the wide conceptual gulf that separates their understanding of freedom from everything that you are looking at the moment. And we can pinpoint the nature of this gulf by saying that these writers do not conceive of freedom as an absence of interference on any understanding of that term, because they do not think of the presence of freedom as marked by an absence at all. Rather, they maintain, and here you can see the divide, that it's nothing to do with everything on the left-hand side of the page. It is about something else. You may not think you'd be in good company if you didn't think, but you'd be in good company if you did think. That's philosophy, friends. You may not think that it makes sense to speak of some activities as fully human by contrast with others that are less than fully human. But if you're willing to entertain the thought that human nature may be normative, in fact, Professor Lear put that point very brilliantly in his opening. I was momentarily cross with him. But here it is, you see, that human nature may itself be normative. Well, if you entertain that thought, then you're going to be able to fill out this notion of self-realization as a theory of positive liberty with as many coherent views as to what might constitute the essence of human nature. So what we need to ask is, well, what specific view about the normativity of human nature did these theorists espouse? Well, they speak with two voices. They espouse two views which have been extraordinarily important throughout the civilization of the West, one of which is classical and the other of which is Christian in provenance. They're much taken, Green especially is much taken, with the Christian thought that we best fulfill our natures in the service of God. But obviously that is not going to ground a political theory, and indeed, of course, historically, it is a rejection of the public life. It's a rejection of the political and of the civic. Hence, of course, Christianity became monastic. When it comes to their politics, they ground their view about self-realization on the claim that we realize the essence of our natures most fully, and hence most fully attain freedom, in the exercise of our talents, not in the service of God, but in the service of the public good. So there you have two views, you might say. One grounded on a classical notion that man is the zoon politikon, man is the political animal, and the other, if you're a Nietzschean, of course, the triumph of the slaves, the rejection of that value in favor of this one. Now, here I'm talking about the high tide of Victorian liberalism. But as before, it's very important to me to emphasize that this genealogy has likewise come down to our own time. Amongst recent philosophers who've reiterated the first of these views, I suppose by far the most prominent is Hannah Arendt, especially in her wonderful essay called What is Freedom, in her collection Between Past and Future. I quote her, "Freedom consists in politics." Wow. I mean, she's not saying it'd be good to be free and, politics might be the politics of the free, or you can create freedom out of politics. Freedom consists in politics, since the activity of self-government and the social virtues this requires is the activity in which we most fully realize ourselves. Yet more recently, a very similar view, although I think it has much more explicitly Hegelian roots, has been developed by Charles Taylor, both in a classic essay, which is called What's Wrong with Negative Liberty? By the way, there's no question mark there. And in his treatise, Sources of the Self. Taylor wants you to entertain a fundamental distinction between what he calls opportunity concepts and what he calls exercise concepts. The mistake, he says, is to think that liberty is an opportunity concept. That's to say, liberty consists simply in there being opportunities for you opened up by absences of interference. But he wants to say, no, that's not what liberty is like. It is an exercise concept. It consists, I'm now quoting him, in the exercise of our powers in a certain way, and especially to help sustain collective control over common life. So as I say, that strand of the genealogy likewise comes down to our time. And I want to say this too. Now, I want to pause at this juncture because I think it would now be generally agreed in contemporary political theory that we do have on our chart about as full an account as we could coherently give of the concept of individual political liberty. But I think that what's really important about the concept is not yet in front of you at all. And that's what I want to spend the last quarter of an hour of these remarks trying to justify. I can best begin to suggest what's, I think, still missing by making a point about Hobbes's argument that I haven't seen commentators on Hobbes, except for me, point out, which is that when he insists that liberty is simply absence of bodily interference, he's making an intensely polemical point. I mean, context is all. What he is doing is trying to discredit a completely different way of understanding negative liberty. And he and his utilitarian followers, Hume through Bentham, right through the utilitarian tradition, were so successful in occluding this other way of thinking about freedom that it's largely become lost to sight. And I want to end by trying to resurrect it. Now, the key contention that Hobbes is trying to discredit takes us back to another ancient text. We're always being brought back, friends, to antiquity in talking about these issues. I mean, that's much saluted in the University of Chicago, but it should be more generally saluted, I think, because here we really need to go right back, as Hobbes does, to the digest of Roman law, the great ancient law code. Like any law code, it's interested in who law is for, and the digest, Justinian's digest, begins with that question. Well, law is obviously for citizens, but we're talking about a slave society. Very large numbers of people are not citizens, they're slaves. Now, a slave is ex hypothesi unfree. If you think there's a free slave, you've lost your grip on a concept, okay? But the question for the law is, what makes a slave unfree? Now, it's crucial that the answer, according to what I shall call a neo-Roman view of things, is not that those living in servitude are necessarily interfered with in the pursuit of their goals. A slave who only ever does his master's or ruler's bidding may never suffer coercive interference. And by contrast, there may be many citizens whose freedom is extensively interfered with and limited in the pursuit of their goals. So what distinguishes the citizen from the slave? The answer is, it's the mere fact of having a master that makes you unfree. The mere fact, that is, of living in dependence on the arbitrary will of somebody else. Or as the digest of Roman law expresses the point, it's living in potestate, in the power, we would still say that, in the power of someone else, and hence at their mercy. That is what takes away freedom. So here is the rival thought. It's not interference that we want as the absence, it's dependence. And that gets us to the core idea of being free. And the reason is that you will not be a liber homo, free man or woman, homo, of course, meaning man or woman. We will not be a liber homo, but a slave, if there could be interference. contrary to your interests and with impunity, due to your dependence on the arbitrary will and power of someone else. Now, notice there's a continuity here with the liberal tradition. Of course, the presence of freedom is marked by an absence. It's just not absence of interference, it's absence of dependence. But there's also a mighty contrast, because what these writers want you to understand is that you could be unfree even if there is no interference with your exercise of your powers at all, nor even any threat of it. Now, that claim seems absurd to many current political theorists. For example, Matthew Kramer devotes a great deal of space in his, I must say, wonderful book, The Quality of Freedom. It's the longest book review I've ever had. Yes, you got the point. Yeah, it is about the iniquity of believing what I'm about to talk to you about. So he says, well, how can there be unfreedom if there's no interference and no threat of it? Well, here's the answer. The fact of dependence takes away freedom of action. Because if you are dependent on the goodwill of someone else, you don't even have to know that you are. Then you never act according to your own will, as freedom requires. Any action you perform will always be the outcome both of your own volition and of the permission of the person who could explicitly or silently prevent and forbid. So all action is permission. So there is no such thing for such a person as free action, because there is no autonomy. But the second point that the neo-Roman writers want to make arises from the consideration that obviously you cannot be living in somebody else's power for long without coming to see that you are living in their power. That would be surprising. Of course, it's possible. In a slave society, you might be born a slave, and only later do you come to see your predicament. But here's the crucial point. You were always in that predicament. The moment the slave owner thinks, I don't like the look of that baby, you're dead. And then you, a bit late, discover you were a slave. That is arbitrary power. Now, in less drastic circumstances, because we're not talking about slavery in the technical sense, I mean the proper sense of the term, we're talking about what it's like to be like a slave. The fact that you've come to be aware that you are living in a certain domain of your life at the mercy of somebody else's arbitrary power, here's the classical thought, will generate self-censorship. So the Emperor Tiberius, you remember in Tacitus, where he said, I have no use meeting the Senate. They're all slaves. Whatever I say, they agree with it. Well, of course, they were very wise to agree with it. That's slavish. You don't need to talk to them. So here's the thought. The fact of dependence takes away freedom of action, and awareness of independence generates self-censorship. Now, you can see the way in which that works, that if you know that your predicament, you have to know, in this case, that your predicament is that you're subject to someone's power in some domain of your life, then in that domain of your life, you have no idea what may happen to you. Nothing may happen, or nothing bad may happen. But anything could happen, because that's arbitrary power. So you will want to do, in that domain of your life, everything you can to minimize the chances that the person at whose mercy you are living might interfere. You're going to try and do everything to stop that happening. So you're going to systematically self-censor in the face of their controlling power. So as the classical moralists put it rather brutally, all slaves are slavish. How can it be otherwise? So notice the dominus, the master, has no need to interfere. He has no need to threaten. Everybody knows. You could say, and I'd like to, that what really interests people who think seriously about this way of thinking about freedom is the silent exercises of power in our societies. Okay, as I said, with the rise of Hobbesian liberalism, which had such an impact on Anglophone philosophy, this all gets discredited and occluded. But I have to add, and this is where I'm ending, nevertheless, there's a kind of rocky descent of dissenting traditions which do take this seriously from the 17th century through to our own. And so we need to ask, who live as slaves? Who are in any domain of their life in a certain kind of servitude? Let me start with the first answer, which was given to Hobbes directly, face to face, in the mid-17th century by James Harrington, the greatest of the English Republican writers, in his Oceana of 1656. All who live as subjects of monarchs live as slaves. How is that? Of course, that is a sensational claim in the early modern period. All monarchs, Harrington says, have prerogatives, and these are discretionary powers. But to the extent that they have discretionary powers, their subjects depend upon their arbitrary will. But to depend upon someone's arbitrary will in any domain of your life is, in that domain, to be unfree. Here's a second thought. This becomes crucial with the rise of the European empires in the early modern period. All who live in colonies under imperial powers live as slaves. This is the argument used against the British by the 13 American colonies in 1776 and deployed by such English defenders of the American Revolution as Joseph Priestley, Thomas Paine, Richard Price. The common core of their argument is that if you are governed, and especially if you are taxed by a colonial power, and thus have no representation in the legislative imposing those taxes, then that is to say that you are entirely dependent on the goodwill of those legislators for the level of taxation imposed. But, as the colonists claimed in the Declaration of 1776, that serves in itself to take away liberty in that domain, because you are left at the mercy of the imperial power in respect of your own property. And of course that explains why the Revolutionary Declaration of 1776 was called, is still called, the Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? Well, from dependence, of course. That's the whole point. From dependence upon the arbitrary power of the British Parliament to set levels of taxation without seeking consent. So here freedom is being explicitly said to be a matter of whether or not in any domain of your life you are wholly dependent, and in respect of taxation, they were. Here's a further answer. This begins to become very important in the revolutionary decades of the 1790s. On this analysis, all women who lack economic independence in that domain live as slaves. Mary Wollstonecraft, writing this extraordinary pioneering tract of Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792. Women, I quote, have to know how to commend themselves to men, upon whom they depend, and are thereby rendered servile in their attitudes. They have to become the sort of people whom men like. So their awareness of their dependence, in other words, generates self-censorship, turns them into a certain sort of a person, so they're not acting according to their own will. To which John Stuart Mill sensationally added in his last tract, The Subjection of Women, which he, incidentally, The Subjection of Women, published in 1869, John Stuart Mill's last major tract, reflects an extraordinary change of mind. I mean, I don't see that Mill scholars place as much emphasis on this as they should, because he converts from being the high priest of liberalism to being a neo-Roman. That's to say, what he wants to say about the subjection of women predates the allowance of women to be testators, that's to say, to make their own wills. Notice the pun there. They don't really act according to their own will if they don't have a will to make. Such a person, I'm quoting Mill, is no different from a bond slave. Nor, I do want to add this. Contemporary examples of arbitrary power? Well, we can all think of them. What about this? We can all think of cases. And if I'm talking about these issues in a university context, one reminder that seems worth making is, do you remember, or do you currently experience, the particular psychological condition of the untenured? What about this? Well, here we... I really want this because this concerns us all, and we can all think of cases. The tendency of the state, which of course is meant to solve our problems, that's why we have it, becoming the problem. Here's one thought that perhaps deserves to be considered more, or rather differently than at present. As we now know, agents of many democratic states possess the power to read our private emails without our consent. This has been framed so far as a debate about privacy, and indeed the exercise of such a power would be an obvious affront to liberty, to privacy. I want to say it is, of course, an affront to privacy, but it is also an affront to liberty. And this is less said than it should be, because we're not thinking about liberty in a way that enables us to get at the truth that we need here. Because our governments have assured us, yours has assured you, mine has assured me, that as our Prime Minister said in the British House of Commons, as long as you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to fear. Well, I mean, first of all, who's deciding what's wrong here? And secondly, the fact that you haven't done anything is absolutely not the point. The point is this: as long as it is known that such powers exist, there is going to be self-censorship. And this must be happening. We know it happens in newspapers. I suspect it happens privately as well. Faced with this power, people will begin to limit what they feel they can say, not because they know what will happen to them if they do say it, but because they don't know what might happen to them if they do say it. So the knowledge of the mere existence of such power is what serves to make us think, I'm not sure if I'll send that email after all, as many people now do. I have friends working on, on some rather sensitive issues at the University of Oxford who tell me they've given up emails for this very reason. Now that is censorship. Self-censorship is a species of censorship. So notice again what we're talking about is the silent exercises of power. Finally, yeah, there it is again. Well, here I draw to a close. So let me now place before you my complete genealogy as I see it, with all the bits of bold type removed, and here's the final accounting. And with that in front of you, I'd like, if I may, in a closing minute, to try to bring out what I think is the point of these historical remarks. I was deeply moved by Professor Lear stressing that historians cannot ablate point. What is the point of all of this? I have 2 points I want to make. And the first is sort of internal to philosophy. Genealogy is always critique, that's the point, and particularly it's critique of conceptual analysis. And the way that this works in the present instance is, I think, as follows. We're repeatedly told in contemporary analytical political theory, in the Anglophone tradition, that there is just one way of thinking about freedom. If you take the most distinguished example you can think of, John Rawls's treatise, The Theory of Justice of 1971, the greatest work of political philosophy of our age, but it is a view that what justice is equal freedom. So what is freedom? In a way, it's a hinge of the book. And he says freedom is, of course, absence of interference with my powers. But I've spoken of writers like Arendt and Taylor who think that freedom isn't a negative concept at all. And I've spoken of a Neo-Roman tradition who think that although it's negative, it's not fundamentally to do with interference or its absence at all. And I've tried to suggest that these positions are coherent in their own terms. My other and final point is that while each of these positions is coherent in its own terms, you've only got to work through what you're now looking at to see that you can't combine these positions. You're going to have to make some choices because they don't fit together. They weren't designed to fit together. What I've shown you is a tremendous turmoil going on. And again, Nietzsche, our concepts are just frozen battles. And we've been left with this particular frozen battle. We need to unfreeze things. And that brings me to the most important question, which is, well, if you have to make choices, which choice should you make? Well, the one thing I really want to say to you this afternoon is that, in my view, university teachers like myself should not go around telling people what to think, especially not in very great universities such as this one. The task, as I see it, is to clarify the issues. You knew all this. This is what Wittgenstein calls assembling reminders for a particular purpose. I've assembled reminders, and that's all I've tried to do. Nietzsche, none of Nietzsche, I don't know what's the matter with me, it's not in my notes, but Nietzsche has a fine remark where he says, you know, the best people to listen to philosophy are cows. Because cows really know how to ruminate. Now, I've tried to present you with information which is relevant, and I think myself, if I have to say something boastful, it's the information relevant to answering the question, how should we think about freedom? But as for the answer, I have to leave that to you to ruminate. Thank you very much. Well, they seem to wait. Yes, certainly.
Do you want me to field them?
Would you, John? No, I'd like you to field them.
So, Professor Skinner is happy to entertain some questions, and I will field them. Please, Rainey. Speak loudly, please.
No, there's a mic. I think there are 2 mics.
Thank you very much. My question is, what bears the weight of the dependence analysis of unfreedom? Is it dependence in se or arbitrary? One could perform a thought experiment in which one had dependence, but the dictates of the master were not only entirely predictable, but reasonable. And indeed, of course, this is the scenario of paternalism.
Yeah.
We could also imagine a scenario in which the arbitrary bore the weight, and one could be an enemy of one's own freedom simply by following caprice, the arbitrariness of one's own will. So I wonder where the emphasis lies here.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question indeed. The weight falls on the notion of the arbitrary, and that stems from the legal analysis in Roman law. As you know, in Latin, arbitrium just means the will. So the issue is, are you wholly subject to someone's will, i.e. to the arbitrary? That's the condition in which autonomy is cancelled. That's the claim. And notice it has 2 modalities. The fact of your being subject in some domain of your life to an arbitrary power, even if you're not aware of it, cancels autonomy, because there's no action of yours which is not also a permission. The arbitrary will can always come into action. But secondly, your awareness of that is productive of the self-censorship, which is the way in which I'm interested in unfreedom arising here. So it arises in the face of arbitrary power because it's a rational response, it's the only rational response. I'm so sorry, does the... What endangers autonomy here is very narrowly circumscribed. We're talking about your capacity to act at will. So, of course, and this would be crucial to Hobbes, the weather can endanger that capacity. Of course. I mean, if I'd been prevented from getting here by a sudden snowstorm, it would have been quite proper to say that I was unfree to come after all, because there was an external agency that prevented it. So there's no difficulty about that on any of these accounts.
Please.
So I think with your response to the last question, it reinforced the question that I have, which is that based on this definition, including whether is potentially a limitation on freedom, basically nobody's free. And so the next question is, that's fine, we can describe nobody on earth as free, but then what we really want to get at is degrees of freedom.
Sure.
And can we talking about degrees of freedom? Would I rather live in the United States, or would I rather live in, pick another country, or, in a temperate climate or an intemperate climate? So maybe that's where we ought to take this discussion in order to, so that it has a little bit more normative implication for what sort of institutions we ought to set up and what sort of society we ought to strive towards.
Good, you've started to ruminate. I think I better make something clear, which is that I haven't declared myself existentially in favor of anything that you're looking at. I'm a genealogist, and it's for you to say what you want to say about your question, not for me to say.
I guess then I just have a request, which is if we can find out a little bit more about either what other people have written or what you're thinking about, at least in a categorization of different types of freedom. Do we think about the probability that we're going to be exercised, have arbitrary power exercised against us? Is it, how do we talk about the degree to which that power is exercised against us, given that it is, those sorts of things? I think
Yes,
would be very helpful.
Of course, absolutely. That's what a serious project of investigating this way of thinking about freedom would have to take up, wouldn't it? Yeah, absolutely. So to come back to your first observations, there would be a way of thinking about freedom in which this is all completely hard-edged. So if you're Matthew Kramer, it is completely hard-edged because Hobbes is fundamentally right about freedom. I haven't said he's right or wrong. I've said it was extraordinarily influential, and I've tried to give an historical account of how it occluded a view and which it was designed to occlude and what developed from it. But you might be a Hobbesian, in which case, of course, a lot of your questions are answered. Yeah.
Your hand was up, yeah, right there.
I wanted to ask you about the question of the example of the type of unfreedom experienced by children, particularly in the Roman context, because I think it gets at an interesting issue that I think about as a historian. When you discuss the liber homo, of course, any free Roman is nonetheless existing under the potestas of his or her father, who can execute or sell into slavery that Roman citizen. Yet the Roman citizen would describe him or herself as free and care very deeply about and be invested in that sense of freedom. A similar case that I work on more myself, working on Florence in the Renaissance, you have Florentines, rioting, waving banners that say Libertas across them, where we can come up with a huge variety of different ways in which any given rioting Florentine is not only disenfranchised, but unfree in many different ways under the dependence, no interference, and self-realization. All three categories often would say that Florentine is unfree from our perspective, and yet waving the Libertas flag and dying for it. So, specifically that kind of where we identify people like children as being under a potestas and yet considering themselves importantly free in another context. Could you discuss that kind of example?
Yeah, very good. By the way, the banners Libertas, of course, Hobbes mocks them. There is written in great characters at this day upon the turrets of the city of Lucca the word Libertas, but no one has more freedom there than in Constantinople, rejecting, of course, the idea that they would be more free if they chose the laws themselves, because the laws would reflect their will. But that's what the banners in Florence are about, of course. And so that's why on the Palazzo Vecchio you also see Libertas, of course. They're fully paid up members of the liber homo story. Yes, in the Roman law, the question of children is, as I'm sure you know well, very hard for them to manage. I mean, it's a joke also. It's almost a joke in the law that the Latin word for children is, of course, liberi, which is also the word for free persons. So etymologically, they're free. But of course, they're not free because they're sub potestate. And that's the paradigm of what it is to be unfree. So what they have to say is, well, it's not very satisfactory, is it? Because this collides with the fundamental categorization of the law, which is, are you a citizen or are you a slave? Well, children are neither. So then you just have to put a lot of emphasis on 2 points, which the law constantly does emphasize. One is age, of course. I mean, they will become free. But the other is a great deal of law about trying to control parents. Yeah, because they are at their mercy. And of course, there's also a great deal of stuff in the Roman law about the fact that slaves are at your mercy, and you have to take that very seriously and behave accordingly. You can't just do what you want. Of course, you can. So these are sore points in the structure of the Roman law, no question.
Please.
At the top of your genealogy, you start off with enjoy freedom as citizens, not as individuals.
Yeah, that was for this sort of reason. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because, I mean, children raised terrible problems for all these theories, and I can go into that if you like, but I just decided, you know, I only had 50 minutes, so I missed out the kids.
These three ways of coming down, roughly Hobbesian tradition with a wrinkle, where we self-interrupt, the self-realization tradition and the Republican tradition. But I wonder if some of the thinkers you've located at various stems here really stay put.
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, whether the ideas, if one tries to think about them, can stay put. So you put Mill as a wrinkle in the Hobbesian tradition because we can self-interrupt and interfere. But it looks like Mill's point about inauthenticity is we fail to realize our interests. I mean, that looks to me like a story, if you spell it out, which is a self-realization story. It's hard to see what inauthenticity is without some conception of what our authentic nature is.
Yeah.
It's going to be very hard to have that then start as a merely privative analysis in the way you suggest.
Yeah.
Which I'll suggest it might not be as far from, on liberty, might not be as far from subjection of women as you suggested, which you were noticing seemed to drift to your third column.
Absolutely.
And also, if the passage on Mill you quoted about how we wind up choosing in mere conformity sure looks like a passage that's partly about self-censorship. Indeed, the two guiding passages of the chapter are conformity and eccentricity. It's about individuality understood as deviating from what everyone else says. And it still looks like if we are self-censoring because we are dependent, we are going to be failing to. And so it looks like everything you have in that column about dependence is something that Mill is worried about while analyzing things along with the top column. So he looks like he's in all three places. Yeah. Marx, or at least the Marxist thinkers who are worried about self-consciousness, I think I could repeat all the points I just made about self-consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And more generally, if you have a self-realization conception and you think freedom is a capacity whose realization depends upon its exercise, and your point about silence power is that it leads us to fail to exercise those capacities, then everything in that column is going to be of concern to such a thinker. Though his starting point will be different, that's true.
Sure.
But everything you have, it seems on that list, will come into his story. So it seems like things are going, the thinkers themselves seem to move around depending on what points we emphasize, and the ideas seem to bleed into each other. I wonder if these three columns are really just so separate.
Well, you've mentioned one thinker who moves around between all three. Yes, these are paradigms.
I meant Marx and Bradley and Green. Those are the other ones I meant.
Yeah, but I was careful not to talk about Marx. These are paradigms. Mill is a mess, yeah. I agree, Mill is. And he's a very interesting mess because he actually changes his mind, and there isn't enough in the literature on Mill on the fact that the 59 essay is recognizably where I've put it. The 69 essay doesn't fit onto that story at all. Furthermore, there are intimations in the 59 essay that he's not completely satisfied with this story. That's absolutely right. Mill is inescapable, but he's not a good paradigm in the sense that Hobbes is, for example, a good paradigm. He says one thing, and he never repeats himself, and he never deviates from that one thing. So what am I doing here? I'm trying to suggest that we could decide by judicious choice of counterexample that practically all of what you're looking at is much more of a mess than that I've suggested. And that's right, I think. But what I've suggested is not wrong. It's just that the question is how many people fall under these categories. These are paradigm cases which it's useful as heuristics to get ourselves going. But there are some extremely large conceptual gulfs that you're looking at. And if you cross those, then it's very doubtful if you've got anything like a coherent theory. And I think that is actually true of Mill, as you do.
We have time for one last question. Eric, would you take that?
Could you have given the same talk under the title, How Should We Think About Slavery?
Well, it's only what I've called the neo-Roman writers who think that the antonym of freedom is slavery. Nobody else thinks that. That's to say, here's the real point. The tradition that I began with, of which Hobbes would be, I'll be really cautious here, he is an unquestioned paradigm. Anyone want to question that? No, that's very wise. Just thinks that freedom is a predicate of actions. If we're talking about freedom, it's a predicate of actions. That's what it is. You can move from there to a position which Hobbes is very aware of and doesn't like the look of and wants to set aside, which is the idea of the free person. And this trenches on what you were saying about antiquity, the liber homo. So if you wanted to break this up yet more, you would say that actually in saying no interference, no dependence, I've suggested an isomorphism which isn't really true to the texts, because what the latter set of texts want to say is, well, let's not talk about either of these categories, because let's not talk about freedom as a predicate of actions. Let's talk about what it means to be a free person. Okay, well then the suggested answer is, not surprisingly, because we're talking about classical roots of this tradition, what it must mean to be a free person is not to be a slave.
So those of you, and only those of you, who would like to exercise your freedom to thank Quentin Skinner, now is an appropriate time to do so. I'm watching carefully.